Good morning. My name is David Cronin. I'm an Irish journalist and political activist. I live in Brussels. I work as an editor with the Electronic Intifada, a website focused on Palestine, and I'm the author of a book called Europe's Alliance with Israel. The subtitle is Aiding the Occupation, and it's published by Pluto Press. It's available in all good bookshops, and or at least in some good bookshops, and directly from Pluto's website. I think the website is plutobooks.com. Perhaps I'll begin by saying a little bit about how I became interested in the question of Palestine. The person to thank or to blame, depending on one's perspective, for my interest is a man now deceased called Ariel Sharon. In the year 2001, I was working for a newspaper called European Voice. It was at the time owned by the Economist Group, publishers of the Economist magazine. And part of my job was to cover European Union foreign policy. I got an opportunity in that year to accompany various European politicians on a trip that they were undertaking to the Middle East. It was quite a short trip, but one thing that really opened my eyes was the fact that we went to a press conference in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem that was given by Ariel Sharon, who was then the Prime Minister of Israel. And to be perfectly honest, I have never been in a room with anybody that struck me as so nasty, so arrogant as Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon started off by describing Jerusalem as something like the capital of the Jewish people for thousands of years, without making any acknowledgement whatsoever that it, for example, is the third holiest city in Islam, and that it's also deeply important to Christians. So he really should have acknowledged that it's a city that's deeply important to people of at least three to people who follow the three great monotheistic religions in the world. He proceeded to say something about Palestinians, basically giving the impression that Palestinians were terrorists. He said something along the lines that he rejoiced when Palestinian suicide bombings occurred because Palestinians were losing their own lives. I can't recall his precise words, but that was the message that he conveyed. But as well as being shocked by what Ariel Sharon said at the time, I was, to be honest, I was actually a little bit impressed really at the time by the, perhaps naively impressed by the attitude of some European politicians to him. At the time, Belgium held the rotating presidency of the European Union, and there was actually a court case going on in Belgium at the time. Belgium had introduced a thing called universal jurisdiction, which essentially allows people to contest to take action against human rights abuses that occur anywhere in the world, very serious human rights abuses that occur anywhere in the world. So this law had been invoked in Belgium to try and hold Ariel Sharon accountable for the Sabra and Shatila massacres in Lebanon in the 1980s when proxy forces, Israeli proxy forces called the Phalange, had carried out grotesque atrocities in Beirut. So the fact that there was a court case taking place in Belgium was a huge source of tension between Belgium and Ariel Sharon at the time, and when this issue was raised, the Belgians said, the Belgian Prime Minister at the time, actually, Guy Verhofstadt, said that the court case had nothing to do with him. What he said was that Belgium was a democracy, so it had a separation between the executive and the judiciary. So I thought that was actually quite clear, that he wasn't prepared to take any nonsense from the Israelis. That he wasn't prepared. He gave the impression that he wasn't prepared to bow to pressure from the Israelis. But of course, I realized a couple of years later that he was indeed put under enormous pressure by the Israelis, and indeed capitulated, that the Belgians capitulated to that pressure. They actually changed the legislation to make sure that these kind of cases would not occur, and indeed something has happened in other countries, including Britain, where similar legislation was introduced, but has subsequently been diluted to make sure that Israeli war criminals will not be held to account. So what Ariel Sharon sparked off really was an interest in Palestine. At the time, I knew very little about the situation, but I began to investigate, began to read it a lot more closely. I began to read a lot more about Palestine, about the history of Palestine, about the situation. And in the year 2007, I think it was, I happened to attend a conference in the European Parliament, which addressed the relationship between the European Union and Israel. And this was the first time that it was really explained to me in very simple terms that Israel had an extremely close relationship with the European Union, and that was involved in all kinds of activities of the European Union. And the European Union had really decided to appease Israel, and to such an extent that it essentially was becoming complicit, or had become complicit in Israel's crimes. So I felt that this is something that very few people know much about, apart from perhaps people in the think tank world and in academia. Very few people outside those very kind of rarefied worlds know much about just how close the European Union is to Israel. So I felt, if nobody else is going to examine this, then I really should do so myself. So I decided then to do the research that led to this book, the Europe's alliance with Israel. Javier Solana, who was the European Union's foreign policy chief, I think from 1999 till around about 2009, said shortly before he stepped down from that role that Israel is a member of the European Union without formally being a member of the European Union institutions. I know that sounds slightly convoluted, but perhaps I'll try and explain what he meant by that. What he meant by that was that Israel has a closer trading relationship with the European Union, has been given more trading privileges by the European Union than most other countries in the world, and Israel is involved in many of the key programs and key activities of the European Union. In the year 2000, a trade and political agreement, it's known in jargon as the Association Agreement, was signed between Israel and the European Union. And this agreement allows goods from Israel, most industrial and agricultural goods from Israel, to enter the European Union's markets without having to pay taxes or customs duties. Article 2 of that agreement says very clearly that any privileges which are given to Israel by the European Union are conditional on respect for fundamental rights. And indeed, it goes further that it indicates that the entire relationship between Israel and the European Union is based on respect for human rights. Anyone who has followed the situation in the Middle East, even superficially, will know that every day Israel violates the basic rights of the Palestinian people. Since that agreement came into effect in the year 2000, Israel has carried out an enormous number of human rights abuses against the Palestinian people. It has behaved in an extremely aggressive manner in Gaza. It has bombed Syria. It has bombed Lebanon. Yet the European Union, even though this agreement is supposed to be legally binding, even this human rights clause is legally binding, the European Union has refused completely to invoke that agreement and has refused to introduce any meaningful sanctions against Israel. Worse than that, it has actually extended the scope of the privileges it has given to Israel, and it has offered new privileges to Israel. For example, in the year 2009 began in a very bloody way with Israel attacking Gaza with the so-called Operation Cast Lead. Thousands of Palestinians were killed in Gaza. Innocent Palestinians were killed in Gaza by Israel in late 2008 and early 2009. A few months later in that year, 2009, the European Union decided to offer new trade privileges to Israel, particularly in the area of food, agricultural trade. We can see the effects of that in our local supermarkets. If you just go to your local supermarket, you will see very many items of fruit and vegetables, herbs, etc., that have a made in Israel label on them. So there appears to have been an increase in the availability of Israeli goods in our supermarkets. That's largely because of those kind of agreements, because of the fact that most foods from Israeli foods can enter the European Union without having to pay taxes or customs duties. In theory, this agreement only applies to food grown within present-day Israel. It's not supposed to apply to food grown on Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. But we know that it's been well documented by organizations like Who Profits that Israel is transporting goods from the West Bank, from the settlements in the West Bank to the interior of present-day Israel, and it's labeling the whole lot as made in Israel. So it's very easy for Israel to circumvent the European Union's rules and to claim these trade privileges, even for goods that are not, strictly speaking, grown in Israel. They're actually grown in illegal settlements. They're in settlements that violate international law in the occupied West Bank. The European Union is really ignoring this issue. Lately, there have been some discussions, some suggestions that the European Union is going to label goods produced in Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Is going to label them as goods produced in settlements in the West Bank, that it'll give some information to consumers about where these goods actually come from. But in my opinion, that's too little too late. Settlements, Israeli settlements, the construction and the expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank constitutes a war crime. These, under the Fourth Geneva Convention, it's illegal for an occupying power to transfer its own civilian population into a territory that it occupies. So the European Union should not actually be importing any goods from settlements, any goods that are grown on settlements in the occupied West Bank at all. Simply putting a label on a product does not negate the fact that it was grown on an illegal settlement, that the product was grown or produced by a company that is benefiting from war crimes. And the fact that the European Union is being so accommodating to Israel, in my opinion, means that it is accommodating Israel's war crimes and is ultimately complicit in those crimes. Another key aspect of the European Union's cooperation with Israel relates to the whole area of scientific research. Israel is one of the most active non-European countries in the EU's multi-annual scientific research program. It's now called Horizon 2020. Israel has been a full member of the EU's research programs since, I think, the 1990s. And indeed has participated on an equal basis to the European Union's own member countries in the EU's scientific research activities since that period, since the 1990s. Israel has actually benefited more and has been able to draw down more grants from the EU's scientific research program than many of the EU's own member countries. Why has Israel been given this kind of privileged access to the EU's scientific research activities? In the last couple of years, I've examined this topic in quite a bit of depth, and I've seen internal papers from the European Commission, the EU's executive, in which Brussels officials have argued that they regard Israel as one of the most scientifically advanced countries in the world, and they feel that if the European Union's own technology sector is to flourish, it needs to have cooperation with Israel. Examples that have been cited are like the fact that some forms of instant messaging, which many of us use regularly on the internet, have been developed by Israeli startup companies. But this kind of simplistic analysis overlooks the fact that Israel's technology sector, its booming technology sector, is intimately connected to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And it's intimately connected to Israel's armaments industry. Israel is not simply developing nice things on the internet. Israel has actually used the security situation, for want of a better term, to what it describes as its competitive advantage. Indeed, that term is even used in enterprise promotion brochures that have been published by the Israeli authorities. There's even a unit in the Israeli, a division in the Israeli military, I think it's called Unit 8200, in which soldiers, conscripts, of course, Israel essentially has a conscript army. It's compulsory for young Israelis to serve in the military. They are actually encouraged. This is something that the Israeli military invests in. They encourage bright young Israelis to develop their technology skills in the military. There's a unit, as I said, in the military that is focused on technological developments, and many of these. The graduates of this unit then go on to work in the Israeli technology sector. But of course, a lot of the cutting edge Israeli innovations of recent years are in the armaments field. Israel is a world leader in drone technology, for example. Drones have been used quite literally to attack, kill, maim men, women, and children in Gaza in recent years. The two main manufacturers of Israeli drones are called Elbit and Israel Aerospace Industries. Both of these companies are taking an active role in the EU's scientific research activities. These companies are among the leading Israeli participants in the EU's. They're among the leading Israeli firms participating in the EU's scientific research activities. They're among the key Israeli beneficiaries of the European Union's scientific research activities. Some of the projects that the European Union has financed relate to the use of drones for things like border surveillance, and the Israeli companies that I've just mentioned are involved in some of the European Union funded activities focused on using drones for border surveillance. What this really means in layperson terms is that the European Union is examining the possibility of using drones that have been tested out in attacks on Palestinians in Gaza for tracking refugees on their way to Europe. I personally find this disgusting. I think it is outrageous that drones that have been used to attack Palestinian refugees in Gaza, remember that most of the population in Gaza are officially categorized by the United Nations as refugees. So drones that have been used to attack one group of refugees, in other words, the Palestinians in Gaza, may well be used to track refugees on their way to Europe in the near future. Indeed, at the moment, there's discussions, quite active discussions. There's planning going on about possibly the European Union. It's more than possibly. The European Union is at this moment preparing an operation in Libya designed to prevent refugees from reaching Europe. Drones are being used in this operation provided by the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, of course, has been involved in much cooperation with Israel in the development of drones. So it's entirely conceivable that drones that have been developed in cooperation between European Union countries and Israel will soon be used to prevent refugees fleeing some of the deadliest conflicts on earth from reaching Europe's shores. As a European Union taxpayer, I find it outrageous that the European Union wants to use, and indeed is using, my tax to bolster the Israeli armaments industry and to use Israeli weapons in what is essentially a racist campaign against some of the poorest people in the world, some of the most persecuted people in the world.